Yeah, thank you so much for these wonderful questions in trying to do some kind of analysis between the two political women giants that we have, the Honorable Rebecca Kadaga and the Honorable Anita Among. So this relationship between these two has actually evolved from what initially appeared to be a strategic coexistence into one of the most consequential internal power structures within Uganda's ruling establishment, especially amongst the people of Busoga. So what makes this politically significant is that the rivalry is no longer merely personal. It has actually become symbolic of generational transition, patronage restructuring, and even regional identity in terms of the politics and the changing architecture of political power within the NRM structure. That is something that's extremely important to note. Now, at one point, the aspect of the Kadaga among relationship indirectly benefited Busoga politically. Kadaga had actually already built herself into what they call a near mythical political figure in the sub-region after years as speaker and one of those who were one of the most high-ranking women in Ugandan politics. Anita Mbong, on the other side, rose initially, and her rising appeared complementary rather than confirmational. And because she's actually married into Busoga through, obviously, Moses Magogo. So many in the region culturally absorbed her into Busoga's political ecosystem. And this gave the impression that Busoga was actually expanding its influence within the national power structure rather than fragmenting it. And so that was good music to the fine people of Busoga. However, the alliance transformed into competitive dual legitimacy. Talk about having two lionesses within the same crowd, if you like. And Kadaga represented historical royalty, liberation era seniority, and even symbolic ownership of Busoga's political identity. Among represented a new age of power, financial mobilization, aggressive networking, institutional control, and proximity to the contemporary center of power. Now, the conflict therefore became a struggle between historical entitlement and emerging authority, and that became the dilemma. Now, listen, the political effects in Busoga have actually been profound, no doubt about that. First, the rivalry has fractured elite unity within the region in terms of local leaders, in terms of members of parliament, in terms of district chairpersons and NRM mobilizers, increasing finding themselves forced into camps. The old Kadaga network, built over decades through loyalty and emotional attachment, collided with Amang's new financial and institutional powerful network. And this definitely caused the collusion and caused the challenge. So this weakened Busoga's ability to negotiate collectively at the national level because internal competition replaced regional consensus. And that became a very big problem, even perhaps as we speak today. Secondly, the struggle exposed a deeper identity crisis within Busoga's political system itself. So for years, Kadaga had actually become almost synonymous with Busoga's political pride, including the aspect of the Chabazingership. Her supporters viewed attacks against her as attacks against regional dignity and even historical contribution to the NRM, leave alone the structure of the Chabazingership. Yet Among's rise complicated this narrative because she was an outsider, in quotes, in the ordinary sense. So through marriage and strategic alliances, she had actually acquired a social-political legitimacy within Busoga, while simultaneously maintaining wider national networks beyond the region. And this created confusion of who actually embodied Busoga's political future. As I said, the question of two lionesses within the same crowd. And now, listen, at the third concept, the conflict accelerated what they call generational transition politics. Yes, the younger politicians in Busoga increasingly began aligning with Amang, okay? Or in terms of not necessarily because of ideological preference, but because of power in Uganda. Power in Uganda often follows perceived proximity to the future. So Kadaga symbolized institutional memory and seniority, while Among projected momentum in terms of state favor, in terms of political survival. And what is interesting is that in African political systems, especially dominant party systems, perceived future access to patronage can rapidly alter these loyalties. And that became a dilemma, or a paradox, if you like. Now, fourthly, in terms of the discussion, we are also able to note quickly that the rivalry also weakened the myth of permanent political ownership. Yes, President Yoweri Museveni reportedly cautioned against framing Busoga as anyone's personal possession during the tensions, yes? And this statement was politically important because it subtly dismantled the assumption that any individual leader could permanently monopolize regional political identity, yes? And that is also something that is important. So, at the grassroots level, the effects have actually been psychologically, divisive in a way. Busoga has historically struggled with questions of economic marginalization despite producing influential national leaders. And many of ordinary Busogas therefore hoped that having both Kadaga and Among at the summit of national politics would actually increase regional leverage, for example. Instead, the conflict created fears that Busoga's political capital was being internally consumed through elite competition rather than converted into collective developmental gains. And that became a serious challenge or debacle, if you like. Now listen, there is also a gendered constitutional dimension to this rivalry. Uganda has rarely witnessed two women operating at such higher levels of state power openly contesting political supremacy with this kind of intensity. Symbolically, it demonstrates that both success and fragility of women's political advancement within highly centralized political systems is something we need to reckon with. Rather, on the other hand, than producing collaborative feminist political consolidation. So the stature of this incentivized survivist competition for proximity to the executive became a big question of debate. Interestingly, the overwhelming victory of Anita Among in the NRM-SEC race fundamentally altered the perception of power within Busoga. Okay, and this demonstrated that modern Uganda political dominance is increasingly determined not merely by historical reality or even liberation credentials, but organizational reach, and then the aspect of financial machinery, and then the question of national allegiance or alliances, and even current regime confidence. Yet, paradoxically, Among's rise may also carry risks. How? Political systems built on rapid accumulation of influence often generate equally into rapid resistance. Some commentators and even perhaps even online discussions increasingly portray her trajectory as a warning about over-concentration of visibility, ambition, and even political centrality within the NRM structure. So, though many such dissections are actually speculative and even partisan, they actually reveal a growing perception that excessively rapid political ascent in Uganda's can actually trigger institutional counterbalancing. And that is something good for food for the soul. So ultimately, the Kadaga among dynamic represents more than simply personal fluid into a mirror of reflection. How? The transition from liberation era legitimacy to transaction political modernity. That is something that we need to think about at food for thought. And then the question of the fragmentation of regional political monopolies is another question of debate. And then the evolution of female political power in Uganda as a force to reckon with. All these are issues that the people of Busoga find themselves in. And then the unstable nature of the elite alliances within the dominant party systems also become a question of debate. These and many so are the questions that befall the people of Busoga. So the question is, Busoga now stands at a constitutional and political crossroad. Whether it evolves into regional defined by competitive elite fragmentation, or whether a new generation reconstructs a unified regional bargaining identity beyond individual personalities. That, my friend, is the question of the day. A revolutionist, like they say, doesn't wait for the apple to fall. He makes the apple fall. Thank you for your attention. My name is Isaac Christopher Lubogo. Find us at suegeneris.com. God bless.